What if I told you that your brain hates admitting it doesn't know? That, faced with a simple gap in information, it prefers to invent an answer rather than accept the silence of doubt? Think about it for a moment. Have you ever been absolutely certain about something, a memory, a conversation, a detail, and then discovered that it simply wasn't true? Not a maybe, not a I think I was wrong, but the uncomfortable feeling of realizing that your mind filled in something that was never there. Have you ever experienced that? Imagine a common situation. Someone asks you about a past event, a decision you made, or even something that just happened. The answer comes quickly, confidently, almost automatically. You speak with conviction. But minutes later, or perhaps days, evidence emerges, a forgotten detail, an unexpected correction. And then comes the shock. How could I have been so sure, and still be wrong? What happens at that moment is not just a memory lapse. It's something much deeper, stranger, and more human. The human brain doesn't handle emptiness well. It dislikes blank spaces, gaps, unanswered questions. When information is lacking, when something isn't clear, the mind kicks in to complete the puzzle. And the most unsettling thing is that it does so convincingly that you feel the answer was always there. It doesn't seem like a guess. It seems like a fact. It seems real. What you're about to discover might surprise you. This mechanism is present all the time, shaping how we perceive reality, how we remember the past, and even how we make decisions in the present. Often we think we are just remembering or interpreting, but in reality the brain is filling in gaps, connecting dots that don't always exist. It constructs a coherent narrative because, for it, coherence is more important than accuracy. And here's something fundamental. Admitting "I don't know" generates discomfort. Uncertainty activates anxiety. Doubt consumes energy. For the brain, it's much more efficient to create a plausible answer than to remain in a state of uncertainty. Even if that answer is incomplete, distorted, or even false, it fulfills an essential role, restoring the feeling of control. Have you ever noticed how the mind prefers a wrong explanation to no explanation at all? This phenomenon doesn't only occur in complex or rare situations. It appears in small, everyday things. When interpreting someone's behavior, filling in memory gaps, trying to understand something too quickly. That's when false memories, inexplicable certainties, and automatic interpretations arise. The brain connects emotions, past experiences, and expectations to create a response that makes sense at that moment. And the more familiar that response seems, the less you question it. Stay with me until the end of this journey, because understanding why the brain does this completely changes how you see your own mind. We're not talking about weakness, stupidity, or distraction. We're talking about a mechanism deeply rooted in how the human brain works, a mechanism that was once essential for survival and that today manifests itself in surprising ways. Perhaps you'll begin to realize that many of the certainties you hold didn't stem from facts, but from gaps filled in automatically. And perhaps from here, you'll start to see with different eyes those situations where everything seems so obvious. Because from the moment we understand how the brain deals with the unknown, an inevitable question begins to form, and that's exactly what we're going to follow now. And perhaps that's exactly why this topic resonates so deeply with us. Because deep down, everyone has felt that silent discomfort of realizing that their own mind has completed something on its own. If this has ever happened to you, a memory that seemed solid, a certainty that later crumbled, it's worth pausing for a second and reflecting on how it made you feel. Confusion, surprise, even a slight insecurity. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you most so far, or a situation where your brain clearly filled in the gap on its own. Reading about these experiences creates something powerful here. The realization that this is not individual, it's human. While you're thinking about this, let me ask you something simple but very important. If this video is making you question how the mind works, liking the video helps this content reach other people who also live through these experiences, but perhaps still don't know how to explain what's happening inside their own heads. This small gesture signals that this type of conversation matters, that it's worthwhile to continue exploring the mysteries of the human brain. And if you feel that this type of reflection captivates you, provokes you, and makes you see reality in a different way, subscribing to the channel is almost a natural step. It's not just about watching new videos, it's about being part of a space where curiosity, science, and wonder go hand in hand. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. People who, like you, have already suspected that the brain doesn't always tell the whole story. Stay with me because from here on out we're going to delve even deeper into this invisible mechanism that operates silently, shaping thoughts, decisions, and certainties. Now that you've realized that the brain rarely accepts "I don't know," the next question begins to take shape. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into next. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding why the brain avoids saying, "I don't know," completely changes how we view our own decisions, certainties, and even the idea of truth. The human brain was not designed for absolute honesty, nor for the tranquil contemplation of doubt. It was shaped over thousands of years to act quickly, interpret incomplete signals, and react before danger became too visible. In evolutionary terms, stopping to reflect too much could cost a life. Questioning excessively, hesitating, admitting ignorance in the face of a hostile environment was risky. Survival demanded immediate answers, even if imperfect. Therefore, when we say that the brain doesn't like to say, "I don't know," we're not talking about pride or stubbornness in the human sense of the word. We're talking about a biological system that interprets uncertainty as a threat. Cognitive silence, that empty space where no answer arises, generates internal tension. It's as if something is out of place, as if the world has become momentarily unstable. For the brain, stability is everything. It needs to feel that it understands what is happening, even when it doesn't. This impulse explains why, faced with incomplete information, the mind anticipates. It creates connections, fills in gaps, and assembles plausible versions of reality. And it does this quickly, behind the scenes, without asking permission. The result is a feeling of clarity that doesn't always correspond to the facts. The answer emerges, the discomfort diminishes, and the brain moves on. The problem is that often this answer is not the result of knowledge, but of an urgent need to close the narrative. When we observe this process carefully, we realize the profound impact it has on our mindset. Many decisions that we believe to be rational actually stem from this invisible fear of uncertainty. The brain prefers an incomplete conclusion to remaining open-ended. It prefers a weak explanation to no explanation at all. This affects everything from simple everyday choices to important decisions that shape relationships, careers, and worldviews. It's a silent transformation that happens without us even realizing it. There is also a hidden truth in this process. The brain confuses speed with efficiency. It believes that responding quickly is always better than responding well. In ancestral environments, this made sense. Today, in a complex world full of nuances, this same mechanism can generate distortions. Even so, the brain continues to operate as if every doubt were an immediate threat. It acts as if it were always in survival mode. This logic explains why admitting, "I don't know," causes so much emotional discomfort. Not knowing is interpreted as a loss of control. It's as if, at that moment, something essential is missing. The mind reacts by trying to regain that control as quickly as possible. And it is at this point that fragile certainties arise, convictions built in haste, answers that seem solid but do not withstand deeper analysis. Behind the scenes of the mind, the brain is constantly trying to maintain a coherent narrative about who we are, where we are, and what is happening. This narrative needs to flow. It cannot stop. Any interruption generates noise. Any gap threatens the continuity of the story. So the brain adjusts, corrects, invents if necessary. It prefers an incomplete story to an interrupted one. When we look at it from this angle, we realize that the problem isn't making mistakes. Making mistakes is part of the process. The central point is understanding that many of our certainties don't stem from truth, but from urgency. They are born from the need to act, to decide, to move forward. This understanding changes how we deal with our own convictions. It invites us to slow down, to observe, to question what seems too obvious. This mechanism also influences how we interpret the behavior of others. We often think we know exactly what someone meant, felt, or thought. But, in practice, we are filling in gaps based on our experiences, emotions, and expectations. The brain does this because it cannot tolerate the emptiness of uncertainty. It needs to close the meaning even if it means distorting reality. This journey of understanding reveals something important. The brain doesn't seek absolute truth, it seeks functionality. It wants answers that allow it to move forward. It wants to reduce discomfort, not necessarily clarify the facts. When we understand this, we begin to realize how much our perception of the world is built in layers, many of them invisible. The impact of this discovery is profound because it presents us with a choice: to continue accepting automatic responses or to develop a greater awareness of how they arise. And perhaps the most interesting point is realizing that this functioning is not a flaw, but an inheritance. An inheritance that once protected us, but which today needs to be observed more carefully. The more complex the reality, the greater the risk of the brain oversimplifying it. The faster the decisions required, the greater the chance of filling gaps with assumptions. This is where a subtle shift in mindset begins. We start to distrust instant certainties a little more. We begin to realize that often what seems like a firm conviction is just the brain avoiding the discomfort of, I don't know. This realization doesn't weaken us, it strengthens us. It opens up space for more conscious choices, for more careful interpretations, for a more honest relationship with our own minds. And as this understanding deepens, something curious happens. Doubt ceases to be a threat and becomes an ally. Cognitive silence, previously avoided, begins to be seen as a space for observation. A space where new questions arise, where revelations occur, where the mind can finally breathe before concluding. It is precisely at this point that the dynamic between speed and truth begins to reveal itself more clearly, and it is from there that new layers of this functioning begin to emerge naturally. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where the workings of the brain start to get really intriguing. When information is lacking, when something isn't entirely clear, the brain doesn't stop and wait. It doesn't raise its hand asking for more data. It simply springs into action. It fills in the gaps. It completes the information. It assumes. And it does all this without asking permission from consciousness. This is the invisible mechanism that operates all the time behind the scenes of the mind, shaping perceptions, memories, and decisions while you believe you are just thinking normally. The most curious point is that this filling in of the gap doesn't happen as a conscious hunch. It doesn't arise from the feeling of, I think that's it. It comes with the force of certainty. The mind delivers the answer already packaged, ready-made, with the appearance of truth. And since this process happens below the level of consciousness, you don't perceive the moment when the gap was filled. You only perceive the final result. A clear idea, a defined memory, an apparently logical interpretation. This mechanism exists because the brain is a sense-making machine. It needs to transform loose fragments into something comprehensible. Faced with incomplete information, it uses everything at its disposal. Past experiences, associated emotions, known patterns, expectations about the world. It's a kind of mental collage done at high speed. The goal is not absolute precision but continuity. To keep the narrative flowing. To maintain the feeling that the world makes sense. This is where many revelations begin to emerge. What you call memory is often a reconstruction. What you call rational interpretation is often a sophisticated assumption. The brain doesn't clearly separate what was experienced from what was inferred. For it, if the story seems coherent, that's enough. This is the hidden truth behind many certainties we hold with such conviction. Behind the scenes of this process, there's a silent logic. The brain prefers to be convincingly wrong than to hesitate honestly. Hesitation consumes energy. Prolonged doubt generates tension. A ready answer, even an imperfect one, brings immediate relief. And this relief is rewarding. It reinforces the behavior. Gradually, the mind learns that filling in gaps quickly is efficient, even if it distorts reality. This process has a profound impact on how we make decisions. Many choices are not made after careful analysis, but after automatically filling in missing information. The brain creates a plausible version of the situation and decides based on it. This influences everything from judgments about people to important decisions that shape life trajectories. It's a silent journey, guided by mental shortcuts that we rarely question. What's most striking is realizing how this mechanism disguises itself as logic. The answer seems rational because the brain knows how to construct convincing narratives. It connects the dots, creates cause and effect relationships, and organizes the facts in a way that seems solid. But behind this organization, there is often a void that was quickly filled. A gap that was never even perceived as a gap. This automatic filling in of gaps also explains why two people can experience the same situation and come away with completely different interpretations. Each brain fills in the gaps based on its own emotional baggage, mindset, beliefs, and experiences. There isn't a single complete version of reality being accessed. There are multiple versions being constructed in parallel. And all of them seem real to those who experience them. When we begin to understand this process, something changes in the way we deal with our own certainties. We start to realize that not everything that seems clear really is. That not every conviction was born from concrete facts. Many were born from the need to close a story. This understanding does not generate paralyzing distrust, but awareness. It opens space for more careful decisions, for a more mature relationship with one's own mind. There is also a significant emotional impact here. When the brain automatically fills in gaps, it protects identity. It maintains a sense of internal coherence. Questioning these constructs too much can generate discomfort because it threatens this stability. That's why we often resist new information that contradicts what we believe. Not because we are incapable of understanding, but because our brain has already closed that narrative and doesn't like to reopen it. This resistance is not a moral flaw. It's a reflection of how the mind works. The brain invests energy in constructing these automatic responses and then tries to defend them. Recognizing this is an important step on this journey of self-knowledge. It's understanding that transformation begins when we realize that not everything that seems obvious originated from objective reality. By observing this mechanism in action, we begin to notice small signs in our daily lives. That instant certainty about someone's intentions. That vivid memory of something that may not have happened exactly like that. That quick interpretation that arises even before you reflect. All of these are examples of the brain filling in gaps in real time, creating a sense of clarity that soothes, but doesn't always clarify. And the faster the world becomes, the more this mechanism is activated. Information arrives fragmented, contexts are incomplete, decisions need to be made quickly. The brain responds by doing what it has always done, filling in the gaps. The risk lies not in this functioning itself but in never questioning it. In confusing speed with truth. In accepting every automatic response as definitive. This understanding changes the mindset. It invites a more curious, more observant stance. Not to doubt everything but to recognize that many internal answers are temporary constructs. They are attempts by the brain to make sense of chaos. And when we understand this, something opens up. A space between stimulus and conclusion. A space where new questions can arise. It is precisely in this space that the great revelations begin. When we realize that the brain fills in gaps without warning, we begin to see reality with more layers. We start to notice not only what we think but how those thoughts are formed. And this awareness changes the way we relate to our decisions, our memories, and what we call truth. As this perception deepens, it becomes impossible not to wonder to what extent what we feel is real was actually experienced, and to what extent it was constructed to keep the narrative functioning. This question doesn't need to be answered now. It needs to be felt. Because it is from this feeling that other layers of this mechanism begin to reveal themselves naturally, leading to an even deeper understanding of how the human mind works. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding why these false answers seem so true is one of the most revealing points of this entire journey. It's not enough to know that the brain automatically fills in gaps. What truly changes how we see ourselves is understanding why these internal constructs gain so much emotional power. What makes an assumption seem like a fact? What transforms an interpretation into certainty? The answer lies less in logic and more in how the brain pieces together reality using emotions, patterns, and past experiences. The brain doesn't work with raw data all the time. It works with meaning. When information is incomplete, it seeks known references to fill that gap. Emotions act as a powerful shortcut in this process. If something evokes a familiar, comfortable, or intense feeling, the brain interprets this as a sign of reliability. The feeling comes before the verification. And when the emotion confirms it, the mind relaxes. The gap is filled. Past experiences also play a central role. The brain learns through repetition. Everything that has been lived, felt, or interpreted previously becomes building material for future perceptions. When a new situation arises, the mind looks for something similar in its internal archive. If it finds a similar pattern, it fills in the rest based on that. It doesn't matter if the details don't match perfectly. What matters is the feeling of continuity. That's the invisible glue that keeps the narrative working. That's why false answers don't sound false. They don't arrive with an error message. They arrive loaded with familiarity. And familiarity, for the brain, is synonymous with security. The more something seems known, the less energy is spent questioning it. The brain understands that if it has been seen before, it doesn't represent a threat. And so, even mistaken ideas pass straight through the critical filter. This logic explains why so many beliefs remain firm even in the face of contrary evidence. It's not just stubbornness or ignorance. It's the brain protecting a construct that has already been emotionally validated. Questioning this construct would require reopening gaps, dealing with uncertainty, and expending cognitive energy. And the brain avoids this whenever possible. It prefers to maintain the version that already seems solid. Behind the scenes of this process, there is a silent economy of effort. The brain is constantly trying to conserve resources. Questioning everything all the time would be impractical. So it creates shortcuts. It uses patterns. It uses emotions as quick indicators. It uses past experiences as templates. The result is a perception of the world that seems stable, but which is built on unexamined assumptions. This mechanism has a direct impact on how we interpret everyday reality. Think about how many times you've known what someone was thinking, feeling, or intending to do without having real proof. The answer came instantly. It seemed obvious. But, in reality, it was the brain filling in gaps based on previous experiences and associated emotions. The familiarity of the feeling gave the impression of truth. The more we repeat an interpretation, the stronger it becomes. The brain understands repetition as confirmation. And so, even a false idea can gain the status of internal truth. This shapes decisions, influences relationships, and directs important choices. It's a silent transformation of mindset, happening without fanfare, but with enormous impact. There's also a deeper layer to all of this. The brain doesn't just fill in the gaps, it defends these constructs. When something threatens an already established response, discomfort arises. This discomfort isn't rational, it's emotional. It's as if the foundation of the narrative is being questioned. And the brain reacts by trying to preserve what has already been built. This reaction explains why changing your mind can be so difficult, even when new information emerges. What we call resistance is often just the brain trying to prevent the collapse of an internal structure that took time and energy to build. This structure may be flawed, but it is functional. It maintains a sense of coherence. And coherence for the brain is a priority. Throughout this journey of understanding, we begin to realize that truth is often not rejected because it is false, but because it is threatening. It demands revision. It demands reassessment. It demands admitting that something that seems solid was not. And this directly touches on identity, on the decisions made, on the stories we tell ourselves. This perception has a profound impact. Not in the sense of deconstructing everything, but of creating a more flexible inner space. A space where familiarity is not automatically confused with truth. Where emotion is not the only criterion for validation. Where decisions can be observed more carefully before being accepted as definitive. As this awareness grows, something changes in the way we look at our own certainties. We begin to notice when an answer comes too quickly. We begin to feel when familiarity is speaking louder than facts. And this perception does not weaken the mind. On the contrary, it strengthens it. It expands the capacity for choice. This is a crucial point in this journey. Realizing that the brain uses emotions, patterns, and experiences as glue doesn't mean rejecting these elements. It means acknowledging them. It means understanding that they are part of human functioning, but they don't need to control everything on their own. When we bring this to consciousness, something reorganizes itself internally. And it is at this point that we begin to see more clearly how the mind constructs convincing realities from fragments. How false answers gain emotional strength. How certainties are formed even before reflection. This understanding paves the way for observing other, even more subtle phenomena that occur when memory, imagination, and expectation mix in unexpected ways. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where the boundary between memory, imagination, and prediction simply ceases to be clear. The brain doesn't organize these three things into separate compartments as we usually imagine. There isn't a clean file called past, another called imagination, and a third called future. All of this happens in the same mental space, mixed, overlapping, in constant reconstruction. What we call memory is often born already permeated by expectation. And what we imagine about the future frequently relies on fragments of the past that didn't always happen exactly as we remember them. Human memory doesn't function like a faithful recording. It functions like an active reconstruction. Every time you remember something, the brain doesn't access an intact file. It recreates that scene using pieces available in the present moment. Current emotions, beliefs, mental state, all of that comes into play. It's as if the brain opens an incomplete file and says, let's complete this with what makes sense now. And once again, the goal isn't historical accuracy, but narrative coherence. In this process, imagination and memory become almost indistinguishable. The brain uses mental images, bodily sensations, and emotions to give shape to something that needs to seem real. If the reconstruction fits, it is accepted. It matters little whether it was experienced, imagined, or inferred. The brain doesn't carry a stamp saying this happened, or this was invented. It carries sensations of familiarity and plausibility. And that is enough to generate certainty. This is precisely where phenomena like false memories come in. Not as something rare or pathological, but as a natural side effect of this process. A false memory doesn't arise from nothing. It is born when the brain fills in gaps in a past event with imagined or suggested elements, until the reconstruction seems complete. Over time, that version comes to be remembered with the same conviction as a real experience. The feeling is the same. The emotion is the same. The certainty is too. Déjà vu fits perfectly into this dynamic. The feeling of "this has already happened" doesn't require the event to have actually occurred. It's enough for the brain to find sufficiently familiar patterns to trigger this response. A combination of context, emotion, and expectation activates that strange feeling of recognition without a clear origin. It's not a true memory, but it's also not a conscious invention. It's a prediction that feels like a memory. An unexpected fit in the mental archive. The brain is constantly trying to predict what comes next. Prediction is one of its central functions. It anticipates scenarios, prepares responses, and creates expectations about the next second. To do this, it uses the same material it uses to remember: past experiences, known patterns, and associated emotions. Predicting and remembering use the same raw material. The difference lies only in the direction of the narrative, not in the mechanism. This mixture creates something fascinating and dangerous at the same time: a feeling of certainty without a real basis. That sudden conviction that something is true even without proof. That intuition that seems too strong to ignore. Often this doesn't come from deep analysis, but from an automatic prediction that fits perfectly into an already existing framework. The brain interprets this fit as a sign of truth. Behind the scenes, all of this happens very quickly. There's no time to question the origin of that feeling. It arises fully formed. And as we've already seen, the brain deeply trusts what is familiar. If the prediction matches something already experienced, even in a distorted way, it is validated. This is a key point in this journey, realizing that many certainties don't come from what happened, but from what seemed probable. This dynamic has a huge impact on how we interpret life itself. Many important decisions are made based on this hybrid mental file, where past, imagination, and future become intertwined. Career choices, judgments about people, interpretations of complex situations. The brain consults this file and offers an answer that makes sense. But this sense is constructed, not discovered. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. The brain doesn't seek objective reality, it seeks predictability. It wants to reduce surprises, minimize risks, and maintain a sense of control. To do this, it creates internal models of the world. These models are fueled by reconstructed memories, plausible imaginations, and constant predictions. When something fits these models, the mind relaxes. When it doesn't fit, discomfort arises. That's why new information that contradicts our certainties generates such an emotional impact. It threatens the model. It demands revision. It asks the brain to admit that it predicted wrong, that it reconstructed poorly, that it filled in gaps inadequately. And this goes against its basic logic of functioning. Yet, it is at this point of tension that transformation occurs. When we begin to understand this mechanism, our mindset changes. We start to observe thoughts and certainties with more curiosity. Not to automatically discredit them, but to recognize where they might be coming from. This awareness creates space. Space for decisions more aligned with reality. Space to accept that not every feeling of certainty needs to be followed. Space to better cope with doubt. This journey of understanding doesn't eliminate illusions, but it makes them visible. And that which is visible loses some of its power to silently control our choices. The impact of this is profound. We begin to see our internal experiences as dynamic constructs, not as immutable records of truth. This doesn't weaken the mind, it strengthens it, because it gives us more autonomy over what we believe. And as this understanding deepens, it becomes increasingly clear that memory, imagination, and prediction are not enemies of reality but tools. Powerful tools that can both guide and deceive us. It all depends on how aware we are of how they operate together. It is at this point that we begin to realize that some of the strangest experiences of the human mind are not flaws, but signs of a system trying to make sense of the world in the most efficient way possible. This understanding paves the way for observing even more subtle phenomena, where the brain not only reconstructs the past or predicts the future, but even repeats experiences, sensations, and interpretations as if trapped in an internal cycle of confirmation. And it is precisely this dynamic that begins to reveal itself when we look more closely at how the mind deals with repetition, familiarity, and the feeling of continuous reality. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we look at this mechanism from a survival perspective, everything starts to make much more sense. The brain didn't become an expert at filling in gaps by chance. This wasn't a design flaw, nor a defect that arose over time. It was a strategy. In ancient, unstable, and dangerous environments, making quick decisions wasn't an optional advantage, it was the difference between staying alive or not. For most of human history, The world offered no time for lengthy analyses or absolute certainties. A noise in the bushes could be the wind, or a predator. A movement in the distance could be nothing, or an imminent threat. In these scenarios, waiting for complete information was too risky. The brain needed to act with what it had. Quickly filling in gaps was a form of protection. Better to misinterpret and flee than to hesitate and become a target. Making a mistake cost less than stopping. This logic profoundly shaped the human mindset. The brain learned that quick responses increased the chances of survival. It began to value action over precision, reaction over reflection. And this became ingrained as a functional truth. A truth that didn't depend on being right but on being useful in that context. The decision needed to come before confirmation. Behind the scenes of this evolutionary process, the brain became increasingly efficient at creating plausible stories from fragments. An incomplete sound, a vague image, a sudden bodily sensation. All of this was enough to trigger a response. The brain didn't ask, "What exactly is this?" It asked, "Could this be dangerous?" And if the answer was maybe, it quickly completed the rest of the story to act. This pattern has saved lives for thousands of years. It allowed our ancestors to move, react, and survive in unpredictable environments. The problem is that the brain hasn't been updated for the modern world at the same speed that reality has changed. Today, most situations we face don't involve predators, but rather incomplete information, social pressures, complex decisions, and constant stimuli. And the brain continues to use the same old strategy, filling in gaps to reduce uncertainty. This is where one of the great revelations of this journey emerges. The mechanism that once protected us now confuses us. The same impulse that helped us survive now creates cognitive illusions. The brain reacts as if every doubt were a threat, even when it isn't. It closes narratives too quickly. It creates certainties where only probabilities exist. It offers automatic answers to problems that would require pause. This evolutionary legacy explains why we feel so much discomfort when we don't know. The "I don't know" is still interpreted internally as risk, as something that needs to be resolved. Even if we rationally know there is no danger, the body reacts. Tension arises. Unease arises. The brain enters resolution mode. It wants to fill in the gaps. It wants to decide. It wants to move forward. This dynamic has a direct impact on modern decisions. Many choices are made under the same old logic. Fast is better than right. The mind seeks to close cycles, conclude stories, eliminate ambiguities. This shapes opinions, judgments, and even deep convictions. Often we don't choose what is most true, but what most quickly reduces the discomfort of doubt. When we look closely, we realize that many cognitive illusions are not isolated flaws, but predictable side effects of this system. False memories, hasty interpretations, emotional certainties without a solid basis. All of this arises because the brain still operates as if it were in an environment where hesitation is fatal. Only now the danger is not physical. It's symbolic. It's psychological. It's the threat of not understanding, of not controlling, of not deciding. This understanding changes how we relate to our own reactions. Instead of fighting against them or judging them, we begin to see them as old responses to new problems. The brain is trying to protect. It's trying to maintain a sense of security. It's trying to ensure continuity. Even when it makes a mistake, it does so with the intention of preserving. There is an important transformation when we accept this. We begin to realize that we don't need to eliminate this mechanism, but learn to observe it. To recognize when a quick response is merely an old reflex, not an accurate reading of reality. To recognize when a certainty arose more from the fear of uncertainty than from the facts themselves. This shift in mindset creates space for something rare in today's world, a conscious pause. A small interval between stimulus and conclusion. A moment where the mind can say, "Maybe I don't have all the information yet." This interval is uncomfortable at first because it goes against the brain's original programming. But it is in this interval that growth happens. It is in this interval that more aligned decisions emerge. Throughout this journey, it becomes clear that many of our strongest convictions were born in contexts where the brain needed to act quickly. But today, acting quickly is not always acting well. The impact of this realization is profound. It invites us to reevaluate not only what we think but how we think. To question the origin of our certainties. To understand that not all internal urgency corresponds to a real danger. And as this awareness deepens, we begin to perceive something even more subtle. The brain not only fills in gaps to make quick decisions, it also repeats patterns that have worked before. It reapplies old responses to new contexts, even when the fit isn't perfect. This repetition creates a constant sense of familiarity, as if certain experiences are repeating themselves, even when reality has changed. It is at this point that we begin to see how the brain, in trying to protect itself, ends up creating internal cycles of interpretation, reinforcing illusions and confirming narratives that no longer serve its purpose. And it is precisely there that another layer of this functioning begins to reveal itself, showing how the mind can end up trapped in its own constructs, repeating patterns of perception without realizing it. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where we enter the strangest territory of all. The moment when the brain not only interprets reality but begins to create one that never existed. We're not talking about conscious fantasy or creative imagination. We're talking about that unsettling feeling of absolute certainty, that inner impression of I know this is true, even when no concrete proof is present. It is at this point that the mind stops merely filling in gaps and begins to construct entire internal worlds to avoid the void of doubt. This feeling of certainty without a real basis doesn't appear fragile or questionable. On the contrary, it comes accompanied by conviction, emotional security, and almost physical feeling of recognition. The brain presents the response as if it were merely revealing something obvious, something that has always been there. And as we have seen throughout this journey, the brain confuses familiarity with truth. If the feeling is known, it assumes that the content is also reliable. What makes all this even more intriguing is that this created reality doesn't seem artificial to those who live it. It doesn't sound invented. It doesn't present itself as a hypothesis. It imposes itself as a conclusion. The brain does this because, for it, a wrong answer is still functional. It reduces anxiety. It closes the narrative. It restores the feeling of control. The absence of an answer, on the other hand, keeps the system on alert, in constant tension. And that's something the brain tries to avoid at all costs. Behind the scenes of this process, a silent choice takes place. Faced with the unknown, the brain evaluates two options: remain uncertain or create a plausible explanation. The first maintains the discomfort. The second offers immediate relief. And almost always, the brain chooses relief. Even if the explanation is incomplete, distorted, or completely false, it fulfills its main function, ending the state of doubt. This is how strange certainties, inflexible intuitions, and convictions that resist facts arise. The mind constructs a version of reality that seems coherent enough to be accepted. And once accepted, it is defended. The brain invests energy in this construction and then tries to protect it, because undoing it would mean returning to the initial void. It would mean admitting that it didn't know. And admitting this is still interpreted internally as a loss of security. This is the mysterious side of the human mind. Not because it's supernatural, but because it happens outside the direct reach of consciousness. You don't perceive the exact moment when reality was fabricated. You only perceive the end result. A belief. A certainty. An internal story that seems to explain everything. And the more emotionally engaging that story is, the harder it will be to question it later. This dynamic appears in small things and in big decisions. It appears when we interpret someone's behavior without confirmation. When we feel we know how something will end. When we have the impression that a situation has already been experienced, even without a clear memory. The brain prefers to complete the experience rather than leave it incomplete. It prefers a closed narrative to an open question. There's a hidden truth here that's rarely discussed. The brain doesn't mind being wrong as long as it's convinced. The error only becomes a problem when it's exposed. As long as the internal construct remains intact, the system functions. Discomfort only arises when external reality directly conflicts with the constructed reality. And even then, the brain often tries to adjust its costumes to preserve the original narrative. This mechanism helps explain why so many cognitive illusions are so persistent. It's not just a lack of information. It's an entire system working to prevent the collapse of an internal narrative. Questioning this narrative requires energy, attention, and a willingness to grapple with uncertainty. It requires switching out of automatic mode and entering a space of more conscious observation. And that's not something the brain does spontaneously. Upon understanding how this works, something begins to change in the way we view our own certainties. We start to notice that some of them didn't arise from reality, but from the need for closure. They emerged to put an end to an uncomfortable doubt. And the sooner that doubt was resolved, the less room there was for questioning. This perception is not intended to generate constant distrust, but to broaden awareness. It is a subtle transformation of mindset. Instead of accepting every certainty as absolute truth, we begin to ask ourselves where it came from. What gap did it fill? What discomfort did it alleviate? This curiosity changes the impact of internal experiences. It restores autonomy. The most curious thing is that, when we begin to observe this process, it becomes more visible. That moment when an explanation emerges too quickly. That feeling of, this can only be the case. That certainty that seems too strong to be questioned. All of this begins to be seen as a possible sign of automatic completion, not necessarily of deep understanding. This journey of perception doesn't eliminate the mechanism. The brain will continue to create responses. That's part of its nature. But the difference lies in recognizing when a response was created to soothe, not to clarify. This distinction changes the relationship with one's own mind. It creates space between sensation and conclusion, between emotion and decision. And as this awareness deepens, we begin to realize that many internal realities have been built up over time, layer by layer, without ever having been examined. Some make sense. Others no longer serve us. Some protect us. Others limit us. Recognizing this doesn't mean tearing everything down, but allowing adjustments. Allowing for updates. It is precisely at this point that the mystery ceases to be frightening and becomes revealing. Because we understand that the brain is not trying to deceive, but to protect. It prefers a wrong answer to no answer because, for it, emptiness is more threatening than illusion. And this understanding paves the way to observe, with even greater depth, how this same mechanism influences our identity, our choices, and the way we give meaning to our own existence. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding why admitting "I don't know" is so difficult for the human mind touches on a much more sensitive emotional layer than it seems at first glance. It's not just about intellectual pride or fear of appearing ignorant in front of others. The discomfort arises long before that. It arises the moment the feeling of control begins to slip. For the brain, not knowing is not neutral. Not knowing is instability. It's as if something essential is missing to keep the world in order. When the mind encounters an unanswered question, the body reacts. A subtle tension arises, an almost invisible unease. The heart may race slightly, attention becomes fragmented, and the feeling of security diminishes. This happens because the brain associates knowledge with predictability. Knowing what is happening, understanding causes and consequences, gives the feeling that the environment is navigable. When this understanding fails, the system goes on alert. Ignorance is felt as vulnerability. That's why admitting "I don't know" generates anxiety. It's not just a phrase. It's an internal state. By saying "I don't know," the brain understands that it has momentarily lost the ability to anticipate what comes next. And anticipating is one of its central functions. Predicting protects. Predicting reduces risks. Predicting maintains a sense of continuity. When this ability is threatened, the mind tries to compensate quickly. At this point, the impulse to fill in the gaps kicks in. The brain creates answers not only to explain the external world, but to protect something even more delicate: identity. The image we have of ourselves as someone who understands, who decides, who knows how to navigate reality. Admitting ignorance can be experienced internally as a fissure in this image. Not because it's true, but because the brain seeks coherence above all else. Coherence is a central value for the human mind. We need to feel that our experiences, thoughts, and decisions are part of a continuous story. When an unanswered question arises, that story remains incomplete. And the brain hates incomplete stories. It tries to close them. It tries to align the dots. Even if it needs to invent a fragile bridge to connect two parts that don't fit together perfectly. This need for coherence explains why so many people prefer a wrong answer to no answer at all. A mistaken explanation still keeps the narrative going. It still preserves the feeling of understanding. "I don't know," on the other hand, leaves the story hanging. And this suspended state is uncomfortable. It demands tolerance for uncertainty, something the brain hasn't naturally developed as a priority. Behind the scenes, the brain is always trying to protect the feeling of internal security. It wants to maintain the idea that the world is comprehensible, that the decisions made make sense, that there is a logic underpinning everything. When something threatens this logic, an almost automatic impulse arises to correct the flaw. And this correction doesn't always come in the form of more information. Often, it comes in the form of a convincing assumption. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we deal with mistakes. Admitting that we don't know something also means admitting that perhaps past decisions were based on incomplete information. It means facing the possibility of having misinterpreted a situation, a person, or an event. This directly affects our sense of identity. The brain tries to avoid this discomfort by protecting the current version of the story. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely acknowledged. The human mind seeks not only to understand the world, it seeks to preserve a sense of inner integrity. It wants to feel that everything fits together, that there is a logical line connecting past, present, and future. When that line threatens to break, the brain intervenes. It adjusts perceptions, smooths out contradictions, fills in gaps. This dynamic explains why changing your mind can be so difficult. It's not just a matter of accepting new facts. It's a matter of reorganizing the internal narrative. And reorganizing requires effort, attention, and courage to deal with the temporary discomfort of uncertainty. The brain prefers to avoid this cost whenever possible. Throughout this journey, it becomes clear that admitting "I don't know" is not just an intellectual act, but an emotional challenge. It's allowing discomfort to exist without immediately trying to eliminate it. It's sustaining for a few moments the feeling of not having all the answers. For the brain, this is counterintuitive. But it is precisely in this space that something new can emerge. When we learn to tolerate "I don't know," we open up space for a real transformation of mindset. We begin to make less reactive decisions. We begin to observe thoughts with more curiosity. We begin to notice when an answer comes too quickly, perhaps more to protect than to clarify. This change doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, built up little by little as awareness increases. This process doesn't eliminate the urge to fill in gaps. The brain will continue to do so. But the difference lies in recognizing when this is happening. Recognizing when an explanation arises more to calm anxiety than to reflect reality. This awareness changes the impact of decisions. It creates an internal space where doubt is not seen as weakness, but as a natural part of the human experience. It is at this point that something important begins to reorganize itself. Identity ceases to be based solely on certainties and begins to include curiosity. The sense of security no longer depends exclusively on quick answers and begins to accept complexity. Internal coherence is no longer built only by eliminating doubt, but by the ability to live with it. When this happens, the brain begins to operate in a slightly different way. Not because its structure has changed, but because it has been given permission not to close all the stories immediately. This small adjustment has a huge impact. It reduces the need for illusions, decreases the rigidity of beliefs, and increases mental flexibility. And as this flexibility grows, we begin to realize that many of the answers that once seemed absolute were, in fact, protective mechanisms. They arose to maintain a sense of control, not to reveal the whole truth. Recognizing this is not losing your footing. It's gaining depth. It's better understanding the inner workings of your own mind. This awareness paves the way for observing how the brain deals with even more delicate situations, especially those in which identity, beliefs, and a sense of continuity are put to the test. Because it is precisely in these moments that the impulse to fill in gaps becomes stronger, more sophisticated, and more difficult to perceive. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after everything we've seen so far, it's clear that this functioning of the brain is not a mistake, nor a flaw to be corrected. It's a profound human trait, a silent inheritance that spans generations and shapes how we perceive the world, make decisions, and construct meaning for our own existence. The brain doesn't fill in gaps because it's weak, confused, or lazy. It does so because it was shaped to survive, to maintain the continuity of experience, and to protect something essential, the feeling that reality is habitable. When we look at it from this angle, a lot changes. What once seemed like a cognitive defect begins to reveal itself as a strategy. A strategy that, in other contexts, saved lives. A strategy that continues to operate today, even in a completely different world. This understanding brings about a kind of silent transformation, because the need to fight against one's own brain ceases to exist. Instead, the possibility of observing it arises. Observing is different from judging. Observing means noticing, in everyday life, how answers arise. How certain certainties appear too quickly. How some interpretations come loaded with emotion, even when the facts are still incomplete. It's noticing that moment when the brain seems to say, "Leave it to me, I'll solve this now," even before you have time to reflect. This moment goes unnoticed most of the time, but when we start paying attention, it becomes visible. This change in attitude doesn't require excessive effort or complex techniques. It begins with curiosity, with small internal questions. Where did this certainty come from? What exactly is missing here? Is this explanation helping me understand or just making me feel more secure? This type of reflection doesn't need to be answered immediately. And perhaps that's the most important point of this whole journey, allowing some questions to remain open for longer. When we do this, something interesting happens. Anxiety decreases. Not because all the answers have appeared, but because the brain begins to realize that emptiness is not as dangerous as it seemed. The mind learns little by little that it is possible to exist without closing all the stories, that it is possible to move forward even without definitive conclusions. This learning doesn't happen all at once. It happens in practice, in the small situations of everyday life. It happens in traffic, in a conversation, when interpreting a message, when remembering something from the past. It is in these moments that the brain tries to automatically fill in the gaps. And it is in these same moments that we can simply observe the process. Not to stop it, but to recognize it. This recognition changes the impact of the internal responses. They continue to emerge, but they cease to be invisible. This awareness also changes how we relate to others. When we understand that each brain is constantly filling in gaps based on its own experiences, emotions, and expectations, it becomes easier to understand differences. It becomes easier to realize that two people can experience the same situation and come away with completely different internal realities. Not because one is right and the other wrong, but because each mind has constructed its own coherent version. There is a hidden truth in all of this that is rarely stated clearly. A large part of human conflict arises not from facts, but from automatic interpretations. From stories that the brain tells itself to quickly fill in the gaps. When we see this, something softens. Rigidity diminishes. The need to defend certainties at all costs loses strength. Space emerges for listening, for revision, for adjustment. This is not a proposal to live in permanent doubt, but to live with more awareness. To recognize that not every feeling of certainty needs to be followed blindly. To accept that some decisions can wait for more information. To allow reality to reveal itself gradually, instead of being immediately molded to fit a pre-existing narrative. Throughout this journey, it becomes evident that observing one's own brain is a powerful exercise. Not in the sense of absolute control, but in the sense of intimacy. We come to better understand the inner workings of our choices, our reactions, and our convictions. This intimacy generates freedom. Freedom to choose more aligned responses. Freedom to revise ideas. Freedom to admit, internally, that some things are still open to interpretation. And perhaps that's one of the greatest impacts of this understanding. Realizing that admitting "I don't know" doesn't have to be a breakdown, but can be a starting point. A fertile space. A place where new perceptions can emerge without haste. Where the mind can rest from the constant obligation to explain everything. When this happens, something changes in the relationship with one's own identity. It ceases to be built solely on certainties and begins to include curiosity, flexibility, and openness. Internal coherence doesn't disappear, it transforms. It stops depending exclusively on quick answers and begins to rely on the ability to navigate complexity. This change isn't visible from the outside. It happens from within. In small adjustments to mindset. In less impulsive decisions. In the willingness to listen before concluding. In the recognition that the brain is always trying to help, even when it creates illusions. Understanding this generates a different kind of respect for one's own mind. And as this respect grows, we begin to realize that observing the brain in action is almost like witnessing a constant creative process. It creates meanings, connects the dots, constructs internal realities. Some useful, others not so much. But all are part of the same effort, to keep the human experience functioning, coherent, and possible. This more attentive gaze transforms common situations into opportunities for perception. A misunderstanding becomes an invitation to reflection. A shaken certainty becomes a chance for revision. A strange feeling becomes a sign that something has been automatically filled in. None of this needs to be resolved immediately. The simple act of perceiving already changes the game. And it is precisely at this point that the reflection deepens. Because when we begin to observe the brain in everyday life, we start to notice patterns. We begin to see repetitions. We begin to perceive how certain internal stories are formed and reinforced over time. This perception does not end the process, it opens it up. It opens space to understand even more subtle layers of this functioning, especially those involving continuity, identity, and the sensation of reality being constantly reconstructed. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. And if all of this made sense to you, if at any point you recognized yourself in these ideas, perhaps that's a good sign that this type of reflection is worth continuing. Subscribing to the channel is a simple way to follow conversations like this, which don't offer ready-made answers, but help to better understand the inner workings of the mind and the decisions we make every day. If you've made it this far, leave a comment writing "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end, I like knowing who went through this entire journey with me." And if this conversation touched you in any way, Liking the video is a silent way to reinforce that connection and support the continuation of this type of content. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic, delving into another layer of how the brain works. Click on it and continue watching.